Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We're putting one of history's most towering figures on the psychoanalyst's couch. Yep, we're talking about the mind of Alexander the Great.
You know, this quote, it's ancient, but it just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? It gets right to the core mystery of Alexander. What on earth was driving this guy? I mean, he conquers the entire known world, and it's still not enough. Why?
So, that's the big question we're tackling. To get some answers, we're going to look at him through some of the sharpest psychological lenses we have. We're talking Freud, Jung, Lacan, and we'll even circle back to the wisdom of the ancient sages. It's going to be a deep dive. All right, let's get into it.
Okay, first up, a Freudian diagnosis. Let's be honest, Sigmund Freud would have had an absolute field day with Alexander's family. I mean, the drama was off the charts, and Freud would say it all starts right there, at the very root of who he was.
Freud had this concept he called the family romance. You know the idea. It's this common fantasy a kid has that their real parents are secretly kings or gods or something way more impressive than their actual mom and dad. But here's the thing with Alexander. For him, this wasn't just some daydream. He took that fantasy and lived it out on the world stage. It literally defined his entire life.
So just think about the choice Alexander had. On one hand, you've got his actual father, Philip of Macedon, a brutal, terrifying, one-eyed warrior king. A very real, very powerful man. But then, on the other hand, you have his mother, Olympias, whispering in his ear that his real dad is Zeus, the king of the gods. What does he do? He goes with the myth. And by choosing the divine father, he's basically trying to completely erase the authority of his earthly one.
And that rejection, that choice, well, Freud would say it left a mark, a massive one. He'd call it a narcissistic wound, a deep, deep injury to his ego. This created an absolutely insatiable need for validation, for approval, and the only way he knew how to heal it, how to prove his greatness to the ghost of the father he rejected, was to conquer, and then conquer some more.
All right, so that's the Freudian take. Now let's switch lenses to Carl Jung. Jung would look at Alexander and see something more than just a wounded ego. He'd see the living, breathing embodiment of a powerful, timeless, mythic archetype.
And that archetype is called the Puer Aeternus, which is just Latin for eternal boy. Think of that person who just refuses to grow up, who rejects all the boring limits of ordinary life, responsibility, getting older, all that stuff. Jung would say Alexander was completely possessed by this. He was this golden boy who could never ever just settle down. He always had to be becoming something greater. The idea of just being a king, ruling an empire, to him that was like death.
And the proof is right there. He died at just 32. 32. He never stopped to rule, never built a stable government. He just kept pushing forward. It's the perfect illustration of the eternal boy. He couldn't stand limits of any kind, not the edge of a map, and ultimately, not even the limit of his own life.
So in Jung's way of thinking, Alexander was projecting his shadow onto the world. The shadow is basically all the stuff about ourselves that we can't stand, that we push down and deny. For Alexander, that was the idea of being a settled, stable, aging king. So what did he do? He saw that shadow self in the old, established Persian Empire, and he felt this absolute compulsion to destroy it. He was literally fighting his own inner demons on the world stage. And in the end, well, those demons, they're what consumed him.
Okay, let's bring in a third perspective, from the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. This one is a little different, but it gives us a really powerful way to understand maybe the most famous story about Alexander.
You know the story of the Gordian Knot, right? This impossibly complex knot, and the prophecy says whoever can untie it will rule Asia. Now, Lacan would call those rules, the prophecy, the expectation to untie it, the symbolic order. It's the system of language and rules we all agree to live by. But Alexander, he just refused. He didn't play the game. He pulled out his sword and just cut right through it. He imposed his will, his own reality, on the problem.
And that one act, cutting the knot, it's a perfect metaphor for his entire life. Lacan would say he was endlessly chasing something called object patia. It's a tricky concept, but think of it as the cause of your desire, that thing that's always just out of reach, that keeps you wanting more. For Alexander, it was always one more river, one more city to conquer. It's why he famously wept when his army finally refused to go any further. Because if the chase stopped, he'd have to confront the big, gaping hole inside. And the conquest was just his way of running from it.
So, we've heard from the modern doctors, Freud, Jung, Lacan. Now we come full circle, back to the ancient sages, and a final diagnosis that, honestly, might be the most profound of all.
There's this amazing story where Alexander, having conquered pretty much everything, shows up at the gates of the Garden of Eden, and he does what he always does. He demands to be let in. But the sages guarding the gate don't argue with him. They don't give him a lecture. They teach him a lesson with an object.
They give him a single bone from a human skull. To be precise, it's the part that holds the eyeball. And they tell him, put this on one side of a scale. On the other side, put all your treasure. All the gold, all the silver, everything you've ever won.
And what happens next is just wow. The scale with all his gold and silver flies up. The side with that single bone, representing the human eye, slams down. It's heavier. Think about that. One human eye is heavier than all the treasure in the world, because the eye is never satisfied. Its desire to see more, to have more, to conquer more is infinite.
But then comes the final, brilliant twist. One of the sages just takes a tiny pinch of dust and sprinkles it over the eye, and immediately the scales flip. His treasure is now heavier. What does that mean? That little bit of dust is the symbol of mortality, of humility. It's the reminder that we're all just dust in the end, and that tiny bit of perspective is all it takes to finally give his endless ambition the proper weight.
So let's pull it all together. Here's the complete profile. For Freud, he's the narcissist trying to outdo his father. For Jung, he's the eternal boy who can't grow up. For Lacan, he's the man who literally cuts through reality. And for the sages, he is the eye that is never satisfied. You put it all together and you get this incredible, complex portrait of a man driven by forces so huge he probably never even understood them himself.
And really, that brings the whole thing back to us, doesn't it? This isn't just a history lesson. It's a question we all have to face. If Alexander is the ultimate I that is never satisfied, and if we're honest, we all have a bit of that in us, what's our dust? What's that little bit of humility or purpose or perspective that we use to keep our own ambitions from getting out of control? Something to think about.